listen up, and I'll tell you what I know about the science of orthostatic tremor and try and, as much as possible, link it in with this stuff. So we've done all this bit for now. It may come in later again here, but figured just cover this. It's probably the bit you need to stay awake the most for, but it's also it's the most fun bit, I think. So this is the first talk I ever gave on orthostatic tremor from 2005, I think, and it was to a bunch of non-doctors. So I thought I'd dust it off and present it to you guys. It was to a group of scientists, so it's obviously going to be scientific, but that's the point. And save up questions or write them down for the end, but I want you to try and poke holes in science's explanation of this disease, and or if anything I say doesn't make sense, just jot it down and we'll discuss it at the end. So the first thing is, I've got to stay out of people's line of sight. I can do a bit of this. All right, so this is the simplified version of the postural control network. There's a few main bits to it. There's motor output, we should just say, not necessarily the motor cortex is one of many parts of the motor output of the brain. The basal ganglia is another one, so is the cerebellum. So they're the output structures, if you like, and feeding into those are the inputs. So there's vision. If you don't have vision, balance is quite challenging, but obviously blind people compensate using their sensory input with canes, and they also compensate with this organ called the vestibular system. So, and conversely, people who have, say, peripheral neuropathy and cannot feel the ground, that impairs balance if it's severe enough. But then again, a lot of the time you can compensate for it if you have these two sensors. Does anyone not heard of the balance organ? Doctors call it the balance organ. It's part of the hearing and cochlear structure. So there's the cochlea, and there's three fluid-filled, they're called semicircular canals, and they're orientated like that, that, and that. You've got one set each side, and the nerve from it feeds in to the cerebellum and other areas. And it tells you, it's basically like a spirit level. If you move, the fluid moves around with it, and in opposite directions on either sides, and it's all very nicely calibrated. And there's a big lump of jelly in the middle which takes care of gravity. So it basically tells you your orientation, even when you're not moving. So if someone hangs you upside down, you still know you're upside down for obvious reasons. So this organ, and you can do all that in the dark, so even with your eyes closed. So when we're thinking about things that can muck around with your balance and postural control, and orthostatic tremor, vision, not impaired, so using it for compensation, but know that when people close their eyes and they have a balance problem, it's much more challenging. So when I do the balance testing, I do it with eyes open and eyes closed, just to enhance the treatment effect if there is one. We'll get to this at the end. Vestibular system, thought not to be impaired at all in orthostatic tremor. The kind of things that affect the vestibular organ are drugs, for one, which aren't used much anymore, but particularly antibiotics can damage the nerves, and the usual things, tumours and certain, there's a disease called Meniere's disease where you get tinnitus or ringing in the ears and you lose vestibular function. And then we get to the more OT relevant areas. So you rely on, there's a tiny little fantastic device in your muscle called a muscle spindle, and it fires depending on how much stretch there is in your muscle. And obviously, if you're standing, your muscles are activated, they're sending signals up through the spinal cord. And then when you're walking, the same thing, except it's in a sort of more rhythmic way. So the brain's using muscle spindle inputs as well as this and vision to coordinate, even just standing. You think you're doing nothing when you're standing, but well, you guys will know, standing's a challenge. So it's like you're constantly making little adjustments to your posture and muscles, and that takes a great degree of neural control. And you can blame, ever since people started walking on hind legs. So this system has developed at some point in evolution. Fish have vestibular organs. And quote me on this, but I'm pretty sure they wouldn't have muscle spindles and other cool ways of keeping them upright because they don't have to. They just have to swim around and know when they're upside down or not. And same thing with four-legged animals. Yes, there's a lot of coordination involved, but actually Great Danes get orthostatic tremor too. It's just a bit true. Yeah. Has anyone ever seen their dog get really excited and have a sort of trembling in their back legs? Don't know what that's about. There's a vet in Western Australia that we almost got together to try and do some research in orthostatic tremor in Great Danes. But so there's another possible clue. Sorry? Possibly. So how did I get onto that? Dogs. Standing upright. Okay. So standing itself is a challenge. Walking even more so because it's a controlled fall. You just have to watch a baby learning to walk and go forward and back and falling over. And so they shape as they're growing, their nervous system takes in environmental inputs, vision and, coordination as it's developing, but also, learning what the ground feels like and, whether it's riding a bicycle or learning to skateboard, the nervous system is constantly capable of learning, and this is relevant when it comes to some of the non-drug treatments that I'll discuss. So anyway, it's all a bit complicated. In the middle of this, there's loops of neural networks, whatever you want to call them, but there's another mysterious, integrator of all this. All these inputs and outputs, and we don't actually know what it's called. It's just so there's no center for balance as such as a whole series of interconnecting networks that control it, which is why it makes some of what we're going to talk about pretty hard to explain. So shaky legs, orthostatic tremor. There's all sorts of rhythms going on in the brain. You can poke an electrode in here and sort of like, listening to music in the brain. There's different frequencies going on, and it depends on what your state of mind is. And, when you're asleep, the brainwave patterns are slower. When you open and close your eyes, that alters frequency in the visual cortex. So there's normal rhythms. Not all rhythms are necessarily, evil. Why these kinds of... So this is the classic orthostatic tremor frequency, and it's about 16 to 24 hertz. There's no other tremor that's at this frequency, so that's why it's kind of like the hallmark of the disease. It's easy to diagnose, if you know it exists, and if that goes for patients as well. This is like a buzzing noise in this wonderful finely tuned network. So the muscle spindles are trying to send their information up to the brain areas and integrate it, and the mythical integrator is trying to put it all together. Meanwhile, there's this annoying humming, buzzing noise, and that's probably the closest we'll come to explaining why this is bad, but there's other theories as well. So you'll see abnormal rhythms in, for example, essential tremor, which is another condition, but that can be localized to the cerebellum. So if you put an electrode in the cerebellum, and they've tracked it to a certain subset of cells in the cerebellum. That's not the case with orthostatic tremor, as best we can understand. There's not been a lot of post-mortem brain pathology studies in orthostatic tremor. And in Parkinson's, for example, if you put an electrode in the areas that we use to treat tremor and other symptoms, there's characteristic signatures of these rhythms and frequencies depending on where you are in the brain. So you do recording at different levels and listen as you're going in, and then when you find the spot you're looking for, there's a certain signature. So again, can't do that with orthostatic tremor. There has been a handful of patients, one of who is here, who's had deep brain stimulation surgery, and I don't actually know the neurophysiology of whether people have measured different areas. The problem is you're sampling in one little area, so you may just hear this kind of echo throughout the whole brain. I suspect that's what you'd hear with orthostatic tremor. Some people have a theory that it's from the spinal cord somehow, but whatever it is, next slide. So the other hallmark clinically is that symptoms only occur on standing. So whatever network that this buzzing noise occurs in is not active when you're sitting down, or not actually, let's say lying down. But yeah, I'll clarify that. You can induce tremor in patients with orthostatic tremor with weight bearing or loading, so people pushing on a wall, you can develop the same tremor in the hands. People they've done, don't ask me why, but studies of people on all fours. I think Peter Bain did this one. Anyway, these that's what I mean, terribly fascinating, and they'll do all sorts of really complicated studies and looking at basically, is the tremor the same in all body parts, and it turns out it is. So there's one rhythm, or whatever you want to call it, one buzzing noise that is distributed throughout all the limbs, and whether or not that tremor is present is dependent on whether there's loading on that body part. So that's why one of the theories is these little muscle spindles. Maybe the muscle spindles are reacting to gravity or force on muscles in some abnormal way and developing the tremor. The feeling of instability, that's the mysterious bit, because the tremor, and this is what I was highlighting here, so there's a latency to the onset of feeling unsteady of several seconds or less. Hang on. Let me just fast forward to a video of a patient. So there's a trace here, which is as soon as Betty stands up, you can actually hear the tremor. But that's when she says, I'm now unsteady, and then at some point during this minute or so, she has to sit down, and the feeling of unsteadiness increases the longer you stand. So that was the point of that. Oh, and then there's so this is the pitch. There you go. Okay, so that's a normal person leaning backwards and forwards, and their muscles are firing in a kind of even burst like that. Okay, so we don't know why that is. Why would it? The tremor starts immediately on standing, but the feeling of instability takes some time to develop, and my simple explanation is that the system can compensate for all this shaking going on in the legs for a period of time, and then it just breaks down and starts to misinform the brain as to where you are in space. Most people don't have frequent falls. I mean, there's other conditions where there's problems with the nervous system affecting balance, and people fall all over the place. The cerebellum, people who've had strokes and things like that, or cerebellar degenerations, chronic alcoholics, people with vestibular failure for whatever reason, they fall a lot. But the other odd thing is that POT patients suffer all this stuff but generally don't fall. So maybe it's the payback for compensating. So you don't fall over so much as with other conditions, but it's at the cost of all this horrible feeling that you're going to fall over, and then at some point your legs fatigue with all the workload, and you have to sit down. Treatment. So when I came on the scene, there was some case studies of this drug gabapentin being helpful, and we did an open label trial finding an effective dose, and then the next stage was to do the gold standard, a blinded trial, and you also need something other than how's your tremor going. So we had to look at what measures there are that we could use. I'll leave that. Right, so there isn't one. If we leave aside the symptom severity for the moment, when it comes to measuring tremor, you'd think it's easy, you just put some electrodes on. But the electrical signal that your muscles generate depends on how big the muscles are, where the electrodes are. So even though you might standardize where you put the electrodes on, it's still not reliable. So we came up with a workaround for that. And the other thing is measuring how much your body sways, which I've already mentioned. Everyone sways a little bit, just like everyone shakes a little bit. There's no perfect stillness. And posturography is what this gadget's about. So a force platform, I don't know why this is, as I said, it's years old. This was a guy, a good friend, who's now in New York doing monkey brain recordings. But so the forces on the platform are, it's basically a very expensive set of bathroom scales. So bathroom scales have one force measure, if you like, whereas force platforms have, at each corner, there's a force transducer, which not only measures how much force is going through, but also if you move around, it'll generate data in 3 different directions. So up, down, front, back, and side to side. And you get these kind of squiggle plots. So this is someone standing for 20 seconds, I think. Front, back, left, right. And on the right, you'll see there's a oval. So the statistical measure is, there's a way of measuring this horrible, messy data, and it's the area in that ellipse. So untreated, this patient swayed around 10 centimetres on gabapentin, about a third or so of untreated, but they don't necessarily feel 70% better. So this measure isn't capturing, it's great, but it's not capturing everything. There's I didn't come up with this, but there's a researcher another guy from the UK that worked out that if you measure the up-down force, so in the Z plane from the platform, and you can do that, you can quantify it. So I think that's a better way of doing it, because instead of measuring individual muscles and how big the wobble is here and there, the signal, sorry, and it's also dependent on which muscles are being loaded at the time. This method captures all the vibrations going through the platform, and it samples it over a decent amount of time, 60 seconds. It's not, it doesn't necessarily capture the whole tremor, but things like how much trunk tremor is part of that, I couldn't tell you, but it's a sum of all the tremor going through the force platform. So there you go, there's another measure that we used in this study in gabapentin. Again, you see it drops that. Oh, I should mention this, sorry, it's the frequency. So this is just background noise, and then there's this big peak at, in this patient, about 14.2 hertz. And with treatment, the peak shifted down slightly. So when you slow down the tremor, obviously it takes longer to get around the circuit, is my thinking. If you inhibit the generator of the tremor, wherever that is, then it's taking longer to get around and make the circuit, so the frequency drops a little bit. And that's seen with alcohol as well. I don't know any other. No one's really studied the older drugs, clonazepam, using these measures. They've just done things like EMG amplitude.
So just going back to that slide there, it's really just the amplitude of the tremor that's being reduced. The frequency is still the same, the amplitude is being reduced. So presumably it's the patient's perception of the tremor that's being reduced.
So this is all objective. So I did do a symptom severity survey, but these are both separate objective measures. This is how much tremor is there, and this is how much body sway there is. And in both cases, they're reduced with treatment. So all we're saying there is that if you give people gabapentin, they sway less, there's less tremor. But the next bit is there a improvement in symptoms? And there was. I'll just get to that. There's also another way of measuring how good you are at balancing, and it's like a balance game where you stand on this platform and you have to shift your center of gravity to one of 8 targets at different positions, and you've got to stand, and then this target will flash up, and this is the thing that I've set up to have a play with later on. You've got to shift your body over here and hold it there in this target for a second, and then come back here quickly and go there. So it was designed to be reasonably challenging, but if you make it too hard, put these targets too far out or too small, then I found patients couldn't actually achieve the target, and you wouldn't get, you just get failure. So with just tuning it right, we were able to measure this first thing, which is called overshoot. So that's just standing upright. That's the 30% is the of well, think of it this way: if you go 100%, you'll fall over. So it's 30% of the way towards falling over, but it's not an exact linear measure. It's just something we used. So firstly, the error in overshooting the target was measured, and then this other measure, instead of going zip straight to the target, people wandering around, and they turned out to be useful indicators as well, which I'll show you. So the patients who are on gabapentin, this is the trial protocol, stopped their gabapentin for a week. There was no withdrawal symptoms, but there was, Beryl, you'll remember, there was a return of symptoms. So even though it was a supposedly double-blind, placebo-controlled trial, we asked patients whether they thought they were on it or not, and they were right. Put them on. I had to hand fill all these capsules for you, Beryl. And it's a really, there was some people on 3-4 tablet capsules 3 times a day. I used gloves, of course. Anyway, so 2 weeks on treatment with measures here and at week 3, and then swap over and do them all again. So there was, that squiggle is the balance platform. That's I actually did EMG electrical recordings as well, just to back up this one, and also quality of life. So let's see if I got a slide on that. Yeah, quality of life. I haven't got a slide here. But there's no actual measure, as I mentioned this morning. So at our clinic, we got this scale that's used for Parkinson's disease, the PDQ-39, which is a nicely, properly designed balance scale for Parkinson's disease, scrubbed out PD and put in OT. And some of the things are very relevant. There's a subscale for mobility, there's one for disease stigma, and another one for body symptoms like pain. So it was pretty good. And there were some that obviously weren't relevant. And I just asked people whether they felt better and by how many % as a rough measure. All right, so you've already seen that one patient data. This is untreated, or sorry, this is the placebo state, 100% up here. And if you stand still as you can with your eyes open and closed for 1 minute, this is the improvement. So people improved about 30%. The other patient that I showed you before, so some patients would improve, or reduce their body sway by 70%, but this is the average of 6 patients. The tremor power, which is, actually this is from the Force platform, so nothing new there. Same thing. These little dots are for statistical significance, which for 6, when you do a study with 6 patients, it's always hard to get. So the fact that you do get statistical significance with 6 patients means it's real to me. And it's also how you get, if your data isn't statistically tested, you can't get anything published these days. I also looked at another measure. This is area, and this is how much time. I think this is an interesting measure of how much work it takes to stand up. So while your legs are shaking away there, you're also travelling more area than normal, and obviously that takes more work. Your muscles are constantly contracting while having to basically draw this squiggly line for a minute. And then the dynamics, so that was less, but not significant, but it's another measure. And then there was this overshoot, so the ability to move accurately. So think real world tasks like reaching up to grab something without overbalancing, and the kind of day-to-day sudden movements you make when you're turning and things like that. That's what that means to me. There was no real change in the accuracy, if you like. So treatment, what does this tell you? That treatment will improve some of the measures, but it's not going to improve all of the symptoms, such as the fatigability perhaps, because, and particularly when you're doing dynamic tasks like walking. So wandering is kind of like the ability to control your centre of gravity while you're walking is, 1 foot at a time, and each step is going to be more effortful if you're wandering more. Actually, this is the part of the... So a measure that I haven't done and would like to do is a measure of this kind of stuff, and tremor, and how much people sway while they're walking. It's been done in a couple of cases that I've seen, so I know it's doable. And the Nord grant is to purchase some wearable, wireless walking and EMG-based equipment that will tell me how accurately people are walking and how much the tremor is there when they're weight-bearing. And if you treat, the tremor, if the tremor improves, does that improve the gait, etc.? And then if I've got a reliable measure for that, then the other treatments, because there are non-drug treatments that I think are helpful in some people. Right, the quality of life. So down is better. And I'll mention at this point, someone published an article where they used a generic quality of life measure in Parkinson's disease and orthostatic tremor and a bunch of neurological conditions, and OT is as disabling as, for example, I keep mentioning Parkinson's disease, but it's the commonest movement disorder. So it's been the biggest studied. So OT, as disabling as Parkinson's. And not just mobility and kind of physical things. There was activities of daily living, they improved, and feeling better. So this subscale included mood type questions. All right, then, so I think Beryl, there's about a dozen, there might be about 20 people now in Perth with orthostatic tremor. I've lost 1 or 2 because they've sort of moved away to different areas, but I would say probably about 80% of people who started gabapentin are still on it. So whether or not they're saying it's fantastic or it's working as well as year one, they're still on it. And if they come back and say, I'm not sure if it's working, I've stopped it, controlled withdrawal to see whether it's working, and it is. So that was, the next step was this drug Pregabalin came out. Same drug company started coming around saying, oh, there's this drug which has the same mechanism of action as gabapentin, and it's more potent, and you only have to take it twice a day. Gabapentin it's a pretty weak anticonvulsant drug, not commonly prescribed. It's not bad for certain types of pain where there's excessive firing in the nerves that carry pain, so painful peripheral neuropathy, that's called. And we actually don't know exactly how it works, again, which is annoying. But you've got to remember that the way drug companies generally, some of them might correct me, but they've got a whole bunch of compounds which they'll test on certain disease models or cell lines. So the epilepsy model or the neuropathic pain model in a rat, and they'll just run them all through, and then they'll get something which appears to be a winner, and then they'll develop it. But you'd think they'd work out exactly how all these drugs work. Gabapentin is an alpha-2 delta calcium channel blocker, and you just go, okay, it's doing something. It's inhibiting nerve cell firing, which is what you can say about all the anti-epileptics. But anyway, you only have to take it twice a day and at a fifth of the dose. So at the very least, OT patients might benefit from having to take less pills. But obviously I was trying to see if it was more potent for the symptoms. And yeah, so take this patient. I didn't mention in the clinical slide, but there's varying degrees of tremor in other body parts. So if you stick a needle in, which is the most sensitive way of measuring tremor, if you stick a needle into muscles in the trunk, arms, even some people have done it in cranial muscles, you can measure this 16 hertz tremor. It's not there in everyone. Why it penetrates the nervous system more in some people and not others, I'm not sure. It could just be a severity thing. If it's worse and a louder noise, then it's going to echo further down the system. But anyway, so this patient 1 had quite a bad essential tremor type upper limb tremor, which is an action tremor, and enough to annoy her and spill cups of tea. Pregabalin had been trialled in pure essential tremor, if you like, upper limb tremor, different disease, and reportedly helped some people, but I haven't found it a winner. So this was interesting. And on top of that, so this is compared with gabapentin, open label. So in this patient, it reduced tremor by this much and body sway by that much, and the arm tremor a lot. But in this person, it reduced sway area massively, 75%. Sorry, all these people clinically improved as well with their OT symptoms in some way, either being able to stand for longer or with less symptoms. Tremor only went down half, but maybe that's a measurement problem. But anyway, so it was somewhat encouraging. There's Betty again. Random slide, I'll just point out, but normally when you contract muscle, there will be no gaps here. There's just a nice, even squiggle. So say that the normal squiggle is about this size. These are huge, massive tremor bursts, like bang, bang. And they're constant and really, really, like the timing is perfectly regular. And that's different from, say, again, Parkinson's disease. Other tremors tend to drift a bit in frequency. So whatever this generator is, I think that's why I think it's got to be some, there's a system that when we evolved to being upright and walking around the place, that system developed, and it was the last system in evolution to develop. You know, vestibular was around the fish, etc. And it's that setup or system that's not functioning in orthostatic tremor. But at least the good news is that in every other respect, your nervous system's working pretty well. So, but yes, so the take-home message that this is the hallmark, and there's some strong driving force, the mythical walking and standing upright centre. I haven't shown you, but this is probably me or someone. So if you said, well, how much more body sway is there? It's clearly abnormal. This is 2 patients. This person, you know, if you look at what I was saying before, the areas aren't that different. A little more on this patient, but for standing the same amount of time, this person has squiggled all over and, you know, travelled so much more. And don't ask me whether it was more effortful to do that stand, because, as I've already said, it's really hard to measure the subjective things. But, you know, I'd suggest that this is maybe a more important measure in some people than just how big the tremor amplitude is. And maybe, you know, maybe there's different subtypes, etc., but that's probably drawing too long a bow because it's such a rare disease. And some people like to split diseases, and some people like to lump them, so there's splitters and lumpers. But for the most part, I'm a lumper when it comes to orthostatic tremor. We've seen that. Oh yeah, just to point out that this is low frequency body sway, so you kind of drift around the place, and that's normal. I couldn't really see any difference in the low frequency sway. Is anyone here a signal processing engineer or anything like that, electronics? Good. I am a hobby signal processing person. I didn't point out before, so you can analyse the frequency of all sorts of things in the nervous system. We already know that this is the signature frequency, but it varies from one person to the next. Why? Again, I don't know why someone's frequency is 20 hertz, but that's, you know, it's probably just a biology thing. We're all a little bit different. Even when it comes to EEG or the background brainwave frequencies, there's a range of normal. I've, for some reason, mashed 2 talks together. Overshoot, as in there isn't any on treatment. Oh, this was the conclusion, my first ever conclusion, I think, to the bunch of scientists. I was trying to explain why things like wandering didn't change, and not so much the path length with treatment. And you know, the point is, I don't really know, but I've come up with this term. So the accuracy of your postural control is better on gabapentin, which is a good thing, but how much variance or, you know, the path you take, either standing still or moving, gabapentin doesn't seem to help that so much. And I'm not really sure whether Pregabalin does either, because I still haven't done the study. So there, that was the conclusion of my first scientific study that I ever did. It was the really good project because there was a good bunch of people in Perth, and there was this guy, Rick Stell, who's my clinical mentor in movement disorders. He's a movement disorders neurologist that's worked in London, and you know, so he's seen loads of patients with orthostatic tremor, and he suggested this project because he'd already started treating people with gabapentin. And there's another esteemed professor of neurology and neurophysiologist and clinic coordinators and balance specialists who taught me how to use it. So I'm just going to acknowledge them at this point. I think I'll pause there. How long did that take? Well, I'm going to stop and take questions.